Welcome to Thread of Terror. We bring you the creepiest stories from Reddit. Dim the lights, grab a blanket, and hit subscribe so you never miss a scare. Story 1. The Silent Curse.
It started in my first apartment in the year 2000. My husband and I had just moved away from home, settling into a quiet complex. From our patio, we often saw an elderly woman tending to her flowers down to the left of us. One evening, chaos erupted outside, sirens blared, and the fire department arrived, trying to break into the elderly woman's unit. She had called for help, then barricaded herself inside, screaming, "No, I will not open it. Leave now." The leasing manager arrived with a key just as the firemen prepared to break down the door. As soon as they entered, they found no fire, no emergency, only the old woman standing motionless. She refused to explain why she called for help. Stranger still, we later discovered her flowers were not real. She had plastic blooms glued in place, yet she still watered the soil around them. When we moved out 2 years later, she stood barefoot in the middle of the road, wearing only a thin house dress, her hair disheveled. She watched us leave with an empty, unsettling stare. We did not think much of it at the time, but the years that followed were filled with misfortune, job losses, deaths in the family, and an overwhelming sense of dread. When we finally moved again, I was out walking my dog one evening when I saw another elderly woman in a house dress. She stepped into the middle of the road, her eyes locking onto me from an impossible distance. A chill ran down my spine. As I approached, she suddenly spoke. "That is your dog. I have not seen you before. Where do you live?" Her voice was flat, emotionless. Something about her made my skin crawl. I hurried past, but she continued speaking behind me, her words now an incoherent murmur. I never saw her again, but soon after my dog fell ill. He passed away within months, then came another job loss, then another death in the family. The same eerie pattern repeated. Was this entity a warning, a harbinger of misfortune, or had something followed us, carrying a curse from one apartment to the next? I do not know, but to this day I dread seeing an old woman standing alone in the middle of the road, watching me as I walk by.
Story 2. The Whispering Children in the Doorway.
When I was 4 years old, my mother, aunt, and grandfather left to assist with disaster relief after Hurricane Katrina. My grandfather had grown up in Louisiana, and he still considered it a core part of his identity. While they were away, I stayed with my older cousin, younger brother, and grandmother for several weeks, though we had no idea how long it would be before they returned. One night I woke up in my grandfather's recliner in the living room. The television was still on, flickering between shows on Cartoon Network. Everything was quiet until I heard something. Soft, deliberate footsteps echoed from the hallway near the front door. I turned my head and saw a shadowy figure moving toward me. At first, I thought it was my mother. Half asleep, I jumped up, ready to run into her arms. But as I got closer, a wave of dread washed over me. Something inside me knew this was not my mother. The figure loomed over me, its face an inky, swirling void. My breath caught in my throat as it looked down at me. Then, in a voice that sent chills through my entire body, it spoke. "Hello." Terror overtook me. I ran back to the recliner, pulled the blanket over my head, and squeezed my eyes shut. Moments later, a faint tapping sound echoed from the entranceway leading into the living room. Slowly, I peeked out from under the blanket, and there it was again. The shadow. I tried screaming for my cousin and brother, who were sleeping nearby, but no matter how loudly I yelled, they did not wake up. My grandmother remained in her room, unaware. Then I saw them. Dozens of small, pale faces peeking over the entranceway, some from the sides, others from above, as if gravity did not apply to them. Their wide, unblinking eyes fixated on me. Their small hands gripped the edges of the wall, their heads tilting at unnatural angles. The shadowy figure stepped forward. "Hello again." I could not take it anymore. I dove between my cousin and brother, squeezing myself into the space between them. The next thing I remember is waking up in the same spot, daylight streaming in through the window. When I told my grandmother what had happened, she listened in silence. I drew pictures of the shadow and the eerie children, and each one disturbed her more than the last. She threw them away the moment I left for preschool and refused to let me speak about it again. Years passed, but the fear never left me. Even now, at 23 years old, the memory sends chills down my spine. Worse yet, whenever I speak about it, like I did with my boyfriend recently, strange things start happening, as if something still remembers me, still watching, still waiting.
Story 3. The Ghost Train of 1912.
I am a 23-year-old male, and I have lived a pretty normal life. But there is one summer night from when I was 15 that I will never forget. I was an ordinary teenager, never one to break rules or seek out trouble. My small group of friends included 3 other guys, one of whom, John, was 17 at the time. That day, John suggested we explore an abandoned factory at night. I hesitated, knowing I would be in serious trouble if my parents found out, but curiosity got the better of me, and I agreed. That night, I sneaked out, and John picked me up. Only 3 of us went, as one of our friends was out of town. The factory was on the outskirts of town, but due to poor roads, we had to park 1.5 miles away and walk along some train tracks. From the moment we stepped onto the tracks, something felt wrong. The air was unnaturally silent. No crickets, no wind, just a heavy stillness. We walked for about 20 minutes until we reached a bridge spanning a dark river. We knew the tracks were still in use, but we were unsure of the train schedule. The bridge was not too far down, but a fall would cause serious injury. We carefully crossed. Not even 5 minutes later, we heard a train approaching, but something was off. It did not sound like a modern diesel engine. It sounded like an old steam locomotive. As it got closer, its whistle echoed through the night, long and mournful. When it finally appeared, we were stunned. It was a steam train, its metal body glistening under the moonlight. But that should have been impossible. Then suddenly, a deafening boom filled the air. We turned toward the bridge just in time to see the train derail, its massive cars plunging into the river below. We ran toward the wreckage, expecting to hear screams or see twisted metal. But when we looked down, the river was calm. No wreckage, no train, nothing. Terror gripped us, and we ran back to the car without a word. The next morning, my curiosity got the best of me. I researched train accidents in our town, and what I found made my blood run cold. In 1912, a passenger train derailed at that very bridge due to a broken rail. Dozens of people perished, most drowning in the river below. I have never set foot on those tracks again, and I never will.
Story 4. Something lived in my great-grandparents' house.
The earliest paranormal experiences I can recall took place inside my great-grandparents' house. After my great-grandfather passed away, I would often stay with my great-grandmother. She lived completely alone, yet we would hear knocks on the doors and walls late at night. Footsteps and whispering filled the silence, accompanied by the sound of pots and pans clanging in the kitchen. I was only 4 or 5 years old. She always reassured me that it was just my great-grandfather and told me not to be afraid. Sometimes, she would even speak to him in a light-hearted manner. I did not fully understand because I was so young. She passed away a year later. After her passing, we moved into the house. I was around 8 years old and in the 3rd grade. The house, built in the 1930s, originally had only 2 bedrooms. I had one room to myself, while my younger twin siblings, barely a year old and still in their cribs, shared the other. My mother and her third husband slept on a hideaway bed that folded out from the couch in the living room. My bedroom door faced the living room, so I could see them sleeping from my bed at night. The first week we moved in, the strange occurrences began. I would wake up to noises and see a shadow moving around the living room. Fear gripped me, and I would bury myself under my blankets, trying to sleep. My chifforobe closet creaked open by itself, and I often heard faint scratching sounds from within. One night, I was startled awake by an intense, blinding light. It was so bright that I thought a car had parked outside my window, but that was impossible. Then, I saw it. A figure, the opposite of a shadow, a being bathed in eerie, glowing light, stood over my mother. Some nights, tapping and scratching echoed from my window. One night, my metal bed frame began shaking, slowly at first, then more violently, as if an unseen force was rattling it. Soon after, I had my first experience with sleep paralysis. The next morning, I confided in my mother. She admitted she had experienced the same thing, a shadowy figure in a hood looming over her, holding her down, draining her energy. We even gave him a name, Hoodie. This was in 1997, before we had the internet, so we had no idea that similar experiences were common. What else lurked in that house? As I grew older, the encounters intensified, but that is a story for another time.
Story 5. Imitating fear.
I am convinced that a mimic visited my house last night. I had been terrified of these creatures since I first heard about them, and it feels like my worst nightmare has come true. It all began around midnight. I was just about to fall asleep, my dog cuddled up beside me as usual. Suddenly I heard knocking on my bedroom door. At first it was just light knocking, almost like someone trying to get my attention. I ignored it, hoping it was just my imagination, but then it escalated. The knocks turned into loud, violent banging, shaking the door as if someone or something was trying to break in. My heart pounded in my chest, and I was paralyzed with fear. I glanced over at my mum, who was sound asleep in the other room, completely unaware. The banging continued relentlessly, each thud louder and more furious than the last. I tried to stay calm, but my fear grew stronger with each passing second. I finally mustered the courage to get up and check the door, but when I reached it, there was nothing there. The silence that followed was deafening. I slowly backed away, still shaken, and returned to my bed, hoping I could just forget what happened. Then, out of nowhere, I heard something that made my blood run cold. A dog bark from outside my room. But it wasn't just any bark. It sounded exactly like my dog when he's trying to wake me up for a walk. The sound was so familiar that it made me jump, but there was a problem. My dog was right next to me, curled up in bed. I looked at him, his eyes wide open, as if he could sense something I couldn't see. I froze. My heart skipped a beat. I knew then that something was terribly wrong. Mimics are known to imitate sounds and voices perfectly, too perfectly. The dog's bark wasn't real. Something else, something terrifying, had been trying to trick me. My dog, who had been by my side the entire time, was now my only connection to reality. I don't know what happened that night, but I will never forget the terror I felt, and I will never again feel safe in my own home.
Story 6. A child's connection to the dead.
When I was around 2 years old, my parents noticed something strange happening in our home. I would often be found playing in the living room, and out of nowhere, I would say, "Our neighbor's mother will come by soon." I said it randomly, at different times of the day, and on various days of the week, as though it were the most natural thing in the world. At first, my parents brushed it off as innocent babbling, But over time, my words started to make them uneasy. They began to notice a pattern. Each time I said it, there was an unsettling tension in the air, as if the words themselves carried a weight of dread. One evening, after hearing me say it again, my mother, now feeling a little creeped out, finally asked, "Why is she coming by?" Without hesitation, I responded, "She is angry." The chill that ran through my mother's spine that night was like nothing she had ever felt before. What my parents didn't know at that time, and what I couldn't possibly have known as a child, was that our neighbor's mother had passed away just a few weeks earlier. No one had told me. I had never seen her in the house again, and yet I spoke of her with such certainty, as though I knew she was still present. The next few days were eerily quiet, but something about the house felt different. It wasn't just the heavy silence, it was something more. Every room seemed colder, the shadows darker, and every creak of the floorboards sent a shiver down my parents' backs. One night, my mother heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps outside my bedroom door, slow and deliberate. She rushed to open it, expecting to see me standing there, but the hallway was empty. My father later confessed that he too had seen a figure standing in the window one evening, but when he approached, there was nothing there. The most terrifying part, I never spoke of the neighbor's mother again after that, but my parents never forgot that year, and they never stopped wondering if what I had said was a warning or a message from the other side.
Story 7. Red Dirt and Haunting Visions.
In 2023, I was visiting my cousin's house, where an evangelical cell meeting was taking place with several children. After the meeting, we decided to play a game of hide and seek in the dark. We played for a few rounds, laughing and running around, but after the third round, we gathered in one of the rooms to chat. That's when something unsettling happened. As I was talking with the others, I glanced at the door and froze. A bride walked by. Her white dress was stained with dark, red dirt, and there were ominous black stains scattered across the fabric. She wore a veil that completely covered her face, and she moved with an eerie, unnatural grace. My heart raced as I stared at her, but as quickly as she appeared, she vanished into thin air. I didn't speak of it immediately, hoping I had imagined it, but deep down, I knew what I saw. The next year, in 2024, I began seeing the same bride again, this time in the school hallways. I would catch glimpses of her standing in the shadows, always watching me. I tried to shake the feeling, but it felt like she was haunting me, her presence growing stronger each time. One evening, during Labor Day weekend, I was watching Amityville, The Awakening, when I heard a strange noise. It sounded like the earth itself was being turned over. I was alone in my mother's room, and panic set in. I ran to the kitchen, trembling, and stayed on the phone with a friend for what felt like hours. After a while, I returned to my room and finished the film, but the unsettling feeling lingered. That night, I had a disturbing dream. I was standing barefoot in my city's cemetery, but it looked different, like something from the 1990s. The ground beneath me was made of red dirt, and I could hear the sounds of a burial taking place. When I woke up, I found that my feet were covered in red dirt. I washed them off, but the dread remained. As I fell back asleep, I had another nightmare, a vision of an old house and 2 children playing on a swing, as if beckoning me. The next few days, the unease grew, and I later learned something horrifying. In my city, a bride had thrown herself onto the train tracks on her wedding day, unable to cope with the emotional turmoil she was experiencing. I realized that this was the woman I had been seeing. her restless spirit unable to find peace. The last time I saw her was in December 2024, standing at my bedroom door, her face hidden by the veil, waiting for something.
Story 8. The Motel Mirror.
When I was about 8 or 9 years old, my family traveled from Denmark to Macedonia by car. It was a 2-day journey, and we would usually stay in either Hungary or Serbia overnight. My parents preferred to stay in Subotica, Serbia, to avoid the notorious robbery incidents that had affected other travelers, including my grandparents in Hungary. One night, we arrived at a motel in Subotica. I shared a room with my mother, while my father and brother stayed in the other room. The room was nothing special, with a bathroom right by the entrance and a wall of wardrobes and drawers to the left. In the middle of the room was a mirror above a table, with 2 twin beds on either side. I hated sleeping on my back, always feeling that someone was watching me from behind. As usual, I tried to fall asleep facing the wall, while my mum slept closest to the entrance. I lay there, wide awake, trying to calm my nerves. Then I heard a crack near the entrance. It sounded like old furniture shifting, which I convinced myself was nothing unusual. But soon after, a louder crack came from the drawer beside the bed. My heart raced, and I held my breath, listening for more sounds. The room was silent for a few moments. Then, to my horror, I saw something in the mirror. A silhouette, a faint, greyish figure, moved slowly across the reflection. It wasn't on our side of the room, but inside the mirror. The figure glided from left to right, vanishing out of frame. The silence that followed was suffocating. Then, with a sudden, violent force, the wardrobe near the mirror was struck with a loud bang, as though someone had punched it. Terrified, I didn't move, didn't blink. I stayed frozen in place, staring at the wall for what felt like hours, until I finally fell asleep. I never woke my mother, though I wish I had. At the time, I thought ghosts weren't real, and I feared no one would believe me. Years later, I told my mother, and she believed me, but she insisted I should have woken her up. The encounter still haunts me. Was it a trick of the mind or something more? Since experiencing sleep paralysis, I know what I saw in Serbia wasn't that. It remains a mystery I can't explain.
Story 9. The Paranormal Bed Shaking Incident.
7 years ago, I had an experience that still haunts me to this day. I was 13 years old, living in a Victorian house built in 1891. The history of the house is a mystery. Despite searching through National Archives, old newspapers and photographs, I couldn't find any information. What I did learn was that it was located in an old mining town which had long been abandoned. I never believed in the paranormal, always relying on logic and reason to explain strange occurrences. But what happened that night has shattered my skepticism. It was between 11 p.m. and 2 a.m., and I had just settled into bed. My cat Nyla was curled up on my chest as I tried to fall asleep. The room was silent, save for the occasional creak of the old house. Then, without warning, my bed began to shake. It felt as though someone had sat down on the bed, rocking it violently back and forth. The shaking lasted for 15 to 20 seconds, and my cat, startled, bolted off me in terror. I lay there frozen, unable to move, trying to make sense of what was happening. At first, I assumed it was just the house shifting. After all, this old house creaked and groaned at all hours. But as I replayed the event in my mind, I realized the explanation didn't add up. The shaking was isolated to my bed, not affecting anything else in the room. There were no vibrations in the floor, no pictures or objects rattling on the shelves. The shaking was too sustained, too deliberate to be caused by normal settling of the house. The headboard, heavy and unattached to the wall, remained eerily silent, with no creaks or sounds of movement. What truly unsettled me was my cat's reaction. Cats are sensitive to things humans cannot perceive. If this had been some sort of hallucination or sleep paralysis, Nyla wouldn't have reacted, but she was as aware of the disturbance as I was. I tried to rationalize it, telling myself it was just a freak occurrence, but deep down, I knew that wasn't the case. The shaking stopped as suddenly as it started, and everything fell silent. I lay awake for hours, too terrified to move, staring at the walls of that old, haunted room. I never experienced anything like that again, but looking back, I wonder how many other strange occurrences went unnoticed. I don't think I'll ever be able to explain what happened that night, but I know one thing for sure: that house was never truly empty.
Story 10. The Dark Secrets of the Haunted Farmhouse.
My family owns a generational farm that dates back to the late 1800s, and there's an old house on the property with a dark past. The house, which has been standing far longer than anyone can remember, was once used as a place for families to take post-mortem photographs with their deceased loved ones, much like a funeral home. Although it's now just a dilapidated farmhouse, the eerie history of the place has always made people wonder if it's haunted. My mother told me stories about how her grandmother used to talk to someone in the kitchen while she was cooking, but we never saw anything until one day my uncle decided to investigate. After taking some photos inside the house, he showed us one where a black figure was visible in the corner of the kitchen. This was just the beginning. A couple of months later, we visited the farm for a holiday, and curiosity got the better of us. My uncle gathered a group of 7 family members, all of us eager to explore the house. The roof and floors were in poor condition, and it had been years since anyone had lived there. We decided to take a photo of the spot in the kitchen where my uncle had seen the figure, using my dad's professional camera. However, the camera wouldn't work inside. We walked outside, and as soon as my dad tried to take a photo, it worked. But once we entered the house again, it malfunctioned once more. Things escalated when my aunt suddenly screamed and accused her daughter of scratching her, but my cousin insisted she hadn't even touched her. We looked at my aunt's arm, and there was a long scratch running down her forearm. Terrified, we stepped outside to discuss what to do next. As we stood on the porch, an old vacuum cleaner inexplicably fell and broke on its own. We went back inside to continue our exploration. My dad and I made our way to the basement, which was pitch dark with no electricity working. I shone my flashlight into the corner, where I saw a hole in the concrete wall. To the left, there were old bottles and jars scattered across the floor, my grandfather's collection. We joked about asking the spirits to show us a sign. Just as we were about to leave, a glass jar came flying toward us and smashed into the wall behind us. Both of us froze in terror. We ran out of the house as fast as we could. From that day on, my father, who never believed in ghosts, was convinced that something dark resided in that house. Later, we realized that the entities seemed to target those not related by blood, like the scratch on my aunt and the jar thrown near my father. I will never forget that night. It changed my perspective on the supernatural forever.
Thanks for joining us on this terrifying adventure. If tonight's story gave you chills, let us know in the comments below and share your own scary experiences too. Don't forget to leave a like if you want more nightmares and subscribe if you haven't already. Until next time, sleep tight and remember, not all shadows are empty.